The avoidance journey toward genuine emotional attachment requires them to confront 5 brutal truths about their own psychological dysfunction, emotional cowardice, and systematic destruction of the very connections they unconsciously crave, but consistently sabotage through sophisticated defensive strategies designed to protect them from vulnerability while ensuring they never experience authentic love or lasting satisfaction in their relationships. These 5 internal reckonings cannot be bypassed, accelerated, or avoided through external circumstances, perfect partners, or ideal relationship conditions. They represent the unavoidable psychological work that the avoidant must complete within themselves before their attachment system can function healthily enough to sustain genuine emotional investment without triggering the defensive responses that have characterized their entire adult relationship history. Understanding these requirements shifts the focus from what others must provide to create attachment in the avoidant to what the avoidant themselves must finally acknowledge, process, and heal within their own psychological landscape. The responsibility for attachment development lies entirely with the avoidant's willingness to face uncomfortable truths about their own behavior, motivations, and the profound damage their defensive patterns have inflicted on themselves and others. Most avoidants spend decades waiting for the perfect partner who will somehow bypass their emotional limitations without requiring them to do the internal work necessary for genuine intimacy and authentic connection. They fantasize about finding someone whose love feels so safe, so understanding, so perfectly calibrated to their needs that attachment will happen effortlessly without confronting their own emotional immaturity and defensive dysfunction. The tragic reality is that no external relationship conditions can compensate for the avoidant's internal emotional underdevelopment, that no partner's patience can substitute for their own courage to face their attachment wounds, and that no amount of understanding from others can replace their need to understand themselves and take responsibility for the relationship destruction their defensive patterns consistently create. These 5 conditions represent the psychological milestones the avoidant must reach through their own emotional evolution, personal growth, and willingness to prioritize authentic connection over the comfortable familiarity of defensive isolation that has protected them from vulnerability while preventing them from experiencing the love and satisfaction they claim to desire, but systematically avoid through their behavior. The avoidant's attachment capacity remains locked behind these internal barriers that only they can remove through honest self-examination, genuine accountability for their relationship patterns, and the courage to choose emotional growth over the psychological safety that their defensive strategies provide at the cost of authentic human connection and lasting relationship satisfaction. Each condition requires the avoidant to abandon comfortable self-deceptions about their emotional sophistication, relationship failures, and defensive patterns, forcing them to acknowledge that their independence is often elaborate dependency, their strength is frequently sophisticated weakness, and their emotional distance represents fear rather than wisdom about human relationships. Understanding these internal requirements reveals why external approaches to winning avoidant attachment consistently fail. The barriers to genuine emotional investment exist within the avoidant's own psychological landscape rather than in their relationship circumstances, partner qualities, or external conditions that they often blame for their inability to sustain authentic, intimate connections with people who deserve better treatment than their defensive patterns allow them to provide. The 5 conditions ultimately represent the difference between the avoidant who remains trapped in cycles of relationship sabotage and the rare individual who develops enough emotional courage to heal their attachment wounds and create the genuine connections they've been unconsciously seeking, but systematically destroying through their own choices, fears, and refusal to do the internal work that authentic love requires from emotionally mature adults capable of sustainable partnership. 1. They must first acknowledge their own emotional cowardice. The avoidance journey toward genuine attachment begins with the brutal recognition that their sophisticated defensive strategies, emotional distance, and relationship patterns represent profound emotional cowardice disguised as strength, maturity, and relationship wisdom. This acknowledgement requires them to stop positioning themselves as the emotionally superior party in their relationship failures and instead confront the reality that their independence often masks terror of vulnerability and their emotional unavailability stems from fear rather than wisdom about human connection. This recognition forces the avoidant to examine how their defensive patterns have systematically destroyed every relationship that offered genuine intimacy and authentic connection, acknowledging that their consistent relationship failures share one common denominator: their own inability to tolerate the vulnerability that genuine love requires from emotionally mature adults capable of sustainable partnership and mutual emotional investment. The cowardice acknowledgement includes confronting their habit of abandoning relationships when emotional intensity increases, running from partners who offer authentic love, and sabotaging connections that threaten to become genuinely meaningful rather than remaining safely superficial and emotionally manageable according to their comfort levels, and defensive programming that prioritizes safety over satisfaction. Understanding their cowardice means recognizing that their emotional walls weren't built to protect valuable treasure, but to hide emptiness. That their independence often represents flight from emotional responsibility rather than authentic self-sufficiency. And that their relationship patterns reveal someone too afraid of emotional pain to risk emotional gain through authentic vulnerability and sustained intimate connection. This acknowledgement becomes most difficult when the avoidant must admit that their sophisticated emotional intelligence and relationship insights have been used primarily to justify their emotional cowardice rather than overcome it. That their understanding of attachment theory serves their avoidance rather than their healing. And that their psychological sophistication has become another defensive strategy rather than pathway to growth. The cowardice recognition also requires acknowledging how they've consistently chosen emotional safety over authentic connection, comfortable loneliness over vulnerable intimacy, and the familiar pain of isolation over the unknown territory of genuine partnership that demands sustained emotional presence and reciprocal investment in someone else's well-being and happiness. Most devastatingly, acknowledging their emotional cowardice means confronting how they've wasted opportunities for genuine love through their defensive choices, how they've hurt people who care deeply about them through their emotional unavailability, and how their fear-based relationship patterns have created exactly the isolation and emptiness they were designed to prevent. This recognition forces them to admit that their relationship problems aren't caused by incompatible partners, poor timing, or unfortunate circumstances, but by their own consistent choice to prioritize psychological safety over authentic connection, emotional protection over genuine intimacy, and defensive distance over the vulnerability that love requires from people brave enough to risk emotional investment. The cowardice acknowledgement includes recognizing that their pattern of emotional withdrawal during relationship challenges represents flight rather than wisdom. That their inability to tolerate their partner's emotional needs reflects their own emotional limitations rather than their partner's excessive demands, and that their systematic relationship sabotage serves their fears rather than their authentic desires for connection. Understanding their emotional cowardice also means acknowledging that they've often blamed their partners for the very emotional intensity and vulnerability that genuine love creates, punishing others for offering the intimacy they claim to want while being too afraid to reciprocate the emotional investment that authentic relationships require from both partners. Most significantly, this acknowledgement requires the avoidant to admit that their emotional cowardice has prevented them from experiencing the very love and connection they unconsciously crave, that their defensive strategies have created the emptiness they were designed to prevent, and that their fear of emotional pain has guaranteed the loneliness and isolation they find most unbearable. The recognition of emotional cowardice becomes the foundation for all subsequent growth, because it eliminates the avoidance ability to maintain comfortable self-deceptions about their relationship patterns, their emotional sophistication, and their defensive strategies that have consistently prevented them from building the authentic connections they claim to desire, but systematically avoid through their choices and behavior patterns. 2. They need to face the emptiness their walls created. The avoidant must confront the devastating reality that their elaborate defensive walls have successfully protected them from vulnerability, while simultaneously creating the profound internal emptiness, emotional isolation, and psychological barrenness they most fear experiencing. These walls, built to preserve their autonomy and prevent emotional pain, have instead constructed a prison where authentic feeling, genuine connection, and meaningful emotional experience cannot survive or flourish. This confrontation requires acknowledging that their emotional numbness isn't strength, but the absence of the very experiences that make life meaningful. The capacity for deep joy, authentic sadness, genuine excitement, and the full spectrum of human emotion that they've systematically suppressed through defensive strategies designed to eliminate vulnerability along with vitality. Facing their emptiness means recognizing that their sophisticated emotional distance has prevented them from developing the internal richness, emotional depth, and psychological substance that characterize emotionally healthy adults who have learned to navigate vulnerability without eliminating their capacity for authentic feeling and genuine human connection. The emptiness acknowledgement includes confronting how their defensive patterns have stunted their emotional development, leaving them psychologically adolescent despite their chronological age and sophisticated intellectual understanding of relationships, attachment, and human psychology that serves their avoidance rather than their growth toward emotional maturity. This recognition forces them to examine the poverty of their internal emotional landscape, where authentic passion, genuine excitement, and deep satisfaction remain underdeveloped because their defensive programming has eliminated the vulnerability required for these experiences to emerge naturally through engagement with life, relationships, and their own authentic emotional truth. Understanding their emptiness means acknowledging that their emotional walls have created exactly what they were designed to prevent: a life devoid of meaningful connection, authentic feeling, and the psychological richness that emerges through sustained emotional engagement with others and themselves rather than defensive withdrawal from experiences that might challenge their comfort zones. The emptiness confrontation also requires recognizing how their systematic avoidance of emotional depth has prevented them from developing genuine empathy, authentic compassion, and the capacity for mutual emotional investment that characterizes healthy relationships between emotionally mature adults who can tolerate vulnerability without losing themselves in the process. Most painfully, facing their emptiness means acknowledging that their defensive success has been their life failure. They've successfully avoided emotional pain while eliminating their capacity for emotional pleasure, prevented emotional wounds, while creating psychological wasteland where authentic joy and genuine satisfaction cannot grow or sustain themselves. This acknowledgement includes recognizing that their emotional isolation has prevented them from learning essential life skills: how to comfort others during distress, how to celebrate others' successes without feeling diminished, how to maintain connection during conflict, and how to provide emotional support without feeling overwhelmed or resentful about others' needs. The emptiness recognition forces them to confront how their defensive patterns have robbed them of life's most meaningful experiences. The satisfaction of being truly known and loved, the joy of providing genuine comfort to someone who matters, the peace of authentic vulnerability with someone trustworthy, and the growth that emerges through sustained emotional engagement. Understanding their internal barrenness also means acknowledging that their sophisticated independence and emotional self-sufficiency have prevented them from experiencing the interdependence that creates psychological richness. the mutual support that enhances rather than threatens individual strength, and the shared vulnerability that deepens rather than compromises personal autonomy. Most devastatingly, facing their emptiness requires admitting that their emotional walls have created the very meaninglessness and isolation they most fear, that their defensive strategies have generated the emptiness they were designed to prevent, and that their fear of emotional pain has guaranteed psychological poverty that feels worse than any emotional wound they might have sustained through authentic engagement. This confrontation with emptiness becomes essential for attachment development because it eliminates the avoidant's ability to romanticize their emotional isolation, justify their defensive patterns, or maintain the illusion that their walls protect something valuable rather than preserving nothing of substance, while preventing everything meaningful from taking root in their psychological landscape. 3. They must recognize their partner's worth before it's too late. The avoidant's capacity for genuine attachment depends on their ability to recognize and acknowledge the exceptional worth of partners who have shown them patience, understanding, and love despite receiving minimal reciprocity, emotional unavailability, and systematic relationship sabotage in return. This recognition requires abandoning their defensive tendency to minimize, dismiss, or take for granted the extraordinary emotional generosity they've received from people whose care they've consistently undervalued and rejected. This recognition forces the avoidant to confront how rare and valuable their partners have been. Individuals capable of seeing their potential despite their defensive behavior, offering emotional support without guarantee of reciprocity, and maintaining faith in their capacity for growth while receiving consistent evidence of their emotional limitations and unwillingness to change their relationship patterns. Understanding their partner's worth means acknowledging that they've been recipients of grace rather than victims of someone's emotional neediness, that their partner's patience represented strength rather than weakness, and that their emotional investment reflected generosity rather than desperate attachment to someone incapable of reciprocal care and emotional availability. The recognition includes confronting how they've systematically devalued people whose emotional intelligence, empathy, and capacity for authentic love far exceeded their own, how they've dismissed as weakness the very emotional courage they lack, and how they've taken for granted the emotional labor their partners provided while contributing minimal effort to relationship maintenance and development. This acknowledgement becomes most painful when the avoidant realizes they've been loved by someone whose emotional maturity, psychological health, and capacity for genuine intimacy could have facilitated their own healing and growth if they had possessed the courage to receive such love rather than rejecting it through defensive patterns and emotional unavailability. Recognizing their partner's worth also means acknowledging that their systematic emotional withholding and defensive behavior has driven away people who could have provided the very connection and satisfaction they unconsciously crave. That their fear-based relationship patterns have eliminated their access to the love they claim to desire but consistently sabotage through their choices. The recognition forces them to examine how they've projected their own emotional limitations onto partners who demonstrated superior emotional capabilities, how they've blamed others for their relationship failures, while those same people showed remarkable patience and understanding for their defensive dysfunction and emotional immaturity. Understanding their partner's exceptional worth means acknowledging that they've often been the problem in their relationship dynamics rather than the victim of others' emotional excess, that their partner's emotional needs were normal and healthy while their inability to meet those needs reflected their own psychological underdevelopment rather than others' unreasonable expectations. This recognition includes confronting how they've interpreted their partner's love as evidence of poor judgment rather than recognizing it as gift they were too damaged to receive. How they've seen emotional investment as weakness rather than understanding it as strength they lacked, and how they've dismissed care as neediness rather than appreciating it as generosity they couldn't reciprocate. Most devastatingly, recognizing their partner's worth often occurs when it's too late to matter, After their defensive behavior has finally exhausted their partner's patience, after their emotional unavailability has convinced their partner to seek connection elsewhere, after their systematic undervaluation has taught their partner to find their worth through sources that don't include them. The recognition becomes most tragic when the avoidant finally understands that they've lost someone irreplaceable through their own choices, that their partner's worth was evident all along but remained invisible to them through their defensive programming, and that their fear of emotional investment has cost them the very connection they needed for healing and happiness. Understanding this worth recognition as essential for future attachment means acknowledging that their pattern of undervaluing exceptional partners will continue until they develop the emotional courage to appreciate what they have while they have it, rather than recognizing value only through loss, and the devastating clarity that emerges when genuine love has been rejected too many times to sustain itself. This recognition also requires understanding that their tendency to minimize their partner's worth serves their defensive need to avoid acknowledging how much they depend on others, emotional labor, patience, and investment in their well-being, making appreciation feel dangerous because it would require admitting their profound need for the very people they've been systematically pushing away through their behavior. 4. They have to admit they've been running from love, not finding it. The avoidant must confront the devastating truth that their entire adult relationship history represents flight from authentic love rather than search for it, that their sophisticated partner selection criteria and relationship patterns have been designed to eliminate rather than discover genuine intimacy and emotional connection. This admission requires acknowledging that their defensive programming has consistently driven them toward relationships that feel safe because they lack the depth and emotional intensity that genuine love creates. This recognition forces them to examine how they've systematically chosen partners who couldn't threaten them with authentic intimacy, people who were emotionally unavailable themselves, geographically distant, or otherwise incapable of offering the sustained emotional presence that genuine love requires. When authentic love has appeared, they fled through relationship sabotage, emotional withdrawal, or sudden departure disguised as incompatibility or poor timing. Understanding their flight pattern means acknowledging that their complaints about partners being too intense, too emotional, or too demanding, often translated to those partners being too capable of genuine love, too willing to be vulnerable, too committed to building authentic connection that felt threatening to their defensive system, designed to prevent exactly such intimacy from developing. The admission includes confronting how they've confused emotional unavailability with strength, mistaken their capacity to remain unattached as sophistication, and interpreted their ability to leave relationships as evidence of their emotional superiority, rather than recognizing these patterns as profound emotional dysfunction that prevents them from experiencing the very connection they unconsciously crave. This recognition requires acknowledging that their relationship failures haven't been caused by bad luck, incompatible partners, or poor timing, but by their own consistent choice to run when relationships threaten to become genuinely meaningful, emotionally significant, or psychologically transformative through sustained intimate connection with someone willing to love them authentically. Understanding their flight from love means recognizing that they've often abandoned relationships precisely when those relationships offered the greatest potential for healing, growth, and genuine satisfaction. That their defensive programming triggers strongest responses to the very connections that could provide what they most need for psychological health and emotional fulfillment. The admission forces them to confront how they've sabotaged their best relationships through defensive behavior designed to create distance when intimacy felt too threatening. How they've systematically destroyed connections with people who offered exactly what their attachment wounds require for healing: consistent love, patient understanding, and sustained emotional availability. This recognition includes acknowledging that their sophisticated understanding of relationships and attachment theory has often served their avoidance rather than their healing, providing intellectual frameworks for justifying their flight from love while avoiding the emotional work required to sustain authentic, intimate connections with emotionally healthy partners. Understanding their running pattern means admitting that they've often been most cruel to partners who love them most genuinely, most dismissive of people who offered authentic emotional investment, and most likely to flee from relationships that provided the safety and consistency their attachment wounds most need for healing and integration. The admission also requires recognizing that their fear of being hurt has guaranteed they experience the very pain they were trying to avoid. The loneliness, emptiness, and isolation that emerge from systematically rejecting opportunities for genuine connection and authentic love that could heal, rather than harm their wounded attachment system. Most painfully, admitting they've been running from love means acknowledging that their defensive strategies have created exactly what they most fear: a life devoid of meaningful connection, authentic intimacy, and the psychological satisfaction that emerges through sustained emotional engagement with someone capable of reciprocal love and mutual emotional investment. This recognition becomes essential for future attachment because it eliminates their ability to blame external circumstances for their relationship patterns, forces them to take responsibility for their consistent choice to flee from love, and requires them to acknowledge that their defensive behavior has been the primary obstacle to experiencing the very connection they claim to desire. Understanding their flight pattern also means recognizing that their next opportunity for genuine love will require them to choose differently, to stay when their defensive system tells them to run, to lean into vulnerability when their programming demands withdrawal, and to fight for connection when their attachment wounds make abandonment feel safer than sustained intimate engagement with someone worthy of their love and capable of loving them authentically in return. 5. They must choose growth over the comfort of dysfunction. The avoidant's final barrier to genuine attachment lies in their addiction to the familiar comfort of dysfunction, where their defensive patterns provide predictable emotional safety at the cost of authentic connection and meaningful satisfaction. This choice represents the ultimate test of their commitment to healing versus their attachment to the psychological comfort zone that has protected them from vulnerability while preventing them from experiencing the love and growth they unconsciously crave but systematically avoid. This choice requires acknowledging that their defensive dysfunction has become their identity, their comfortable prison, and their primary source of psychological security, despite its failure to provide lasting satisfaction or meaningful connection. They must recognize that choosing growth means abandoning the familiar territory of emotional distance, relationship sabotage, and defensive isolation that feels safe because it requires nothing challenging from them. Understanding this choice means confronting how their dysfunction serves their psychological comfort by eliminating uncertainty, vulnerability, and the emotional labor required for authentic relationship maintenance and development. Their defensive patterns provide the illusion of control and safety while preventing them from experiencing the unpredictability and emotional investment that genuine love requires from emotionally mature adults. The growth choice becomes most difficult because it requires the avoidant to function without their familiar defensive strategies, to navigate relationships without their usual emotional distance, and to engage with vulnerability without their sophisticated withdrawal tactics that have provided psychological comfort throughout their adult life, despite their failure to create lasting satisfaction. This choice includes accepting that growth will feel uncomfortable, uncertain, and emotionally challenging in ways that their defensive dysfunction has protected them from experiencing. That healing their attachment wounds requires sustained emotional courage that feels foreign and frightening to someone whose identity has been built around emotional self-protection and defensive distance. Choosing growth over dysfunction means acknowledging that their current relationship patterns, while comfortable and familiar, have consistently failed to provide the connection and satisfaction they actually desire, that their defensive strategies serve their fears rather than their authentic needs, and that continued avoidance will guarantee continued emptiness and isolation. The choice requires them to admit that their sophisticated defenses have become limitations rather than strengths, that their emotional distance has become a barrier rather than protection, and that their attachment avoidance has prevented rather than enhanced their capacity for psychological satisfaction and authentic human connection. Understanding this choice means recognizing that they must actively work against their defensive programming, consciously choose vulnerability over safety, and deliberately engage with emotional intensity rather than retreating into the familiar comfort of detachment and isolation that has characterized their entire approach to intimate relationships. The growth choice also includes accepting responsibility for developing new emotional skills, learning unfamiliar relationship behaviors, and sustaining uncomfortable levels of vulnerability and emotional presence that feel foreign and threatening to someone whose defensive system has been designed to eliminate exactly these challenging but necessary aspects of authentic, intimate connection. Most significantly, choosing growth over dysfunction requires the avoidant to tolerate the anxiety and uncertainty that accompany emotional healing, relationship development, and sustained intimate engagement without retreating into their familiar defensive patterns when growth becomes uncomfortable or emotionally challenging. This choice becomes essential for attachment because it represents their willingness to prioritize long-term satisfaction over short-term comfort, authentic connection over defensive safety, and emotional growth over psychological stagnation that has provided familiar security while preventing meaningful progress toward the intimate relationships they claim to desire. Understanding the growth choice also means accepting that they cannot maintain their defensive comfort while simultaneously developing authentic attachment capacity. That genuine emotional investment requires abandoning the psychological safety that their dysfunction provides, and that meaningful relationship development demands sustained emotional courage that feels antithetical to their defensive programming. The ultimate choice between growth and dysfunction determines whether the avoidant will continue repeating their familiar relationship patterns while expecting different outcomes, or develop the emotional courage necessary to build authentic connections that require them to function outside their comfort zone while providing the satisfaction and meaning that their defensive strategies have consistently failed to deliver despite their psychological comfort and familiar security.